She was the daughter her father loved most, the diplomatic bride adored by her people, the mother who bore 10 children for a dynasty. But in the end, it was this very duty of motherhood that claimed her life at only 30 years old. Her death was not just a private tragedy. It was the echo of a curse tied to thrones across Europe, where love was traded for duty and youth was crushed beneath the weight of power. This is the tragedy of Infanta Catalina Micaela. In the autumn halls of Madrid, where marble floors reflected the glow of 1,000 candles and the air carried the scent of incense from endless chapels, a child was born who would become her father's quiet solace. Infanta Catalina Micaela entered the world in 1567, not as the heir to Spain's vast empire, but as a daughter, one more branch in a dynasty that stretched across Europe. Yet to Philip II, who already bore the burdens of a kingdom that spanned oceans, Catalina was more than another child. She was, in time, to be his companion in solitude. Her life began under a shadow. When Catalina was only a year old, her mother, Elizabeth of Valois, the French princess who had been Philip's beloved third wife, died suddenly. The court mourned, but for Philip, the loss was searing. His young queen, full of grace and laughter, was gone, leaving behind 2 small daughters. One of them, the infant Catalina, would never remember her mother's face, yet she carried the echo of her gentleness. Philip was not a man known for warmth. Chroniclers describe him as austere, silent, a ruler who kept his distance even from his own family. But with Catalina, there was something different. Perhaps because she reminded him of Elizabeth, perhaps because her presence softened the sharp edges of his loneliness, he drew her closer. While other monarchs might delegate such affection to governesses, Philip allowed Catalina into his private world. He let her sit beside him while he worked through endless documents, her small voice occasionally breaking the silence of El Escorial, the vast stone monastery palace he had built as a symbol of Spain's might and his devotion to God. Those who visited the king often remarked on her presence. In a court renowned for its rigid etiquette, Catalina stood out, not by defiance, but by the gentle way she filled the void around her father. The courtiers whispered that she was the soft light of El Escorial, a living balm to a man otherwise consumed by statecraft and the grinding machinery of empire. Philip saw more than a daughter. He saw someone he could trust. Catalina's intelligence was clear even in her youth. She listened intently to his words, absorbed the weight of his advice, and in time, he began entrusting her with small matters. Letters to be read, notes to be passed, small observations about the people around them. To outsiders, they may have looked like trivial tasks, but within the suffocating stillness of royal life, they were profound. Catalina was not just learning. She was becoming her father's confidant. Her education reflected her position. Tutors instructed her in languages, history, and theology, preparing her not for rule, but for influence. In Renaissance Spain, a princess's duty was not to wield power directly, but to embody it gracefully, to carry the Habsburg name into foreign courts and alliances. Catalina absorbed this destiny quietly, though whether she embraced it or resented it remains hidden in the silences of history. What we do know is this: she grew into a woman of uncommon serenity. Her contemporaries described her as gentle but steady, a presence that soothed rather than agitated. Unlike her half-sister, Isabella Clara Eugenia, who displayed sharp political instincts, Catalina seemed less drawn to the maneuverings of politics. Yet paradoxically, it was precisely this calmness that made her invaluable. To a father known for suspicion and control, Catalina's loyalty was a rare comfort. It is striking to imagine the moments between them. Philip seated at a heavy desk, his face illuminated by candlelight, parchment and ink spread before him. And Catalina beside him, her hands folded, listening, absorbing. These were not the scenes of grand councils or public ceremonies. They were quieter, more intimate. The private rituals of a king and his daughter, bound not just by blood, but by a shared solitude. But even this closeness could not protect her from the fate that awaited all royal daughters. In the Habsburg world, love was not a personal choice, but a political calculation. Every child was a piece on the chessboard of Europe, destined to cement alliances, to bind houses together, to trade flesh and blood for treaties and armies. Catalina may have been Philip's beloved, but she was not exempt from this rule. Her childhood, gilded and tender in her father's company, was a prelude to a harsher chapter. Soon, the same father who once clutched her small hand in the long halls of El Escorial would sign the papers that sent her across the mountains, away from Spain, into a marriage that would demand everything of her body and spirit. For now, though, she remained the beloved daughter. The little girl who had lost her mother too soon, who gave comfort to the loneliest king in Europe, who carried in her smile the fading warmth of Elizabeth of Valois. History remembers Philip II as stern, calculating, obsessed with empire. But within the walls of El Escorial, in the quiet hours before dawn, there was a gentler story, that of a father who found, in his daughter Catalina, the only light that could pierce the granite weight of his crown. And perhaps that is where her tragedy begins. For when a child becomes her father's comfort, she also becomes his sacrifice. Catalina would not live for herself. She would live for Spain, for Savoy, for the dynasty that consumed generation after generation in its relentless hunger for survival. She was cherished, yes, but cherished not as a free woman, only as a symbol, a bond, a gift to be given away. The child who was once the soft light of El Escorial would one day burn out like a candle left too long in the wind. The year was 1585, and the Spanish court once again dressed itself in silks and gold. Trumpets blared, banners fluttered, and voices echoed through Madrid's chambers. But beneath the celebration lay calculation. Infanta Catalina Micaela, barely 18, was to be married, not to a man of her own choosing, but to a duke whose lands were prized by Spain's crown. Charles Emmanuel I, Duke of Savoy, was no ordinary suitor. His territory in northern Italy straddled the crossroads of Europe, a strategic prize pressed between France, Switzerland, and the Italian states. To Philip II, Catalina's father, this marriage was not about romance. It was about cementing Spain's grip on Italy and protecting his empire's lifeline. For Charles Emmanuel, it was about legitimacy. To marry the daughter of the most powerful king in Europe was to cloak his small duchy in imperial dignity. So Catalina, who had once been her father's cherished confidant, was transformed into a piece of the diplomatic puzzle. The girl who brought solace to the lonely king was now the bride who would anchor Savoy to Spain. The wedding itself glittered with ceremony. Chroniclers describe the grand procession, the clash of music, the solemn exchange of vows that bound Catalina's fate to a man she barely knew. Yet the grandeur could not mask the truth. This was a transaction. She was leaving behind the stone halls of El Escorial, the familiar rhythms of her father's presence, and embarking on a path of duty that would consume her completely. Charles Emmanuel was ambitious to the point of restlessness. He dreamed not of quiet rule, but of conquest. His gaze was fixed on territory expansion, wars to be won, and titles to be seized. Turin, the heart of Savoy, was a court in constant motion, filled with soldiers, emissaries, and schemes. Catalina, gentle and steady, entered this world as if stepping into a storm. At first, she played her role dutifully. The people of Turin welcomed her with open arms. To them, she was not only a duchess, but a symbol of connection to Spain's might. Her presence meant protection, trade, and status. Catalina, who had inherited her mother's grace and her father's devotion to order, adapted quickly. She oversaw charitable works, listened to petitions, and became a figure of compassion in a land often overshadowed by its duke's aggressions. But behind the polished facade of diplomacy, her reality was harsher. Charles Emmanuel, so consumed by campaigns and ambitions, was often absent. He left Catalina to preside alone over a court that demanded constant vigilance. She was expected to manage the intricacies of etiquette, to soothe disputes among nobles, to serve as a maternal figure not only to her own children, but to an entire duchy hungry for stability. And then there were the pregnancies. From the moment she crossed the Alps into Savoy, Catalina's body became both battlefield and bargaining chip. A duchess's worth was measured in heirs, and Catalina bore this burden with quiet endurance. Year after year, she was with child. Year after year, she endured the risks of childbirth, her body wearing down under the relentless demand to produce sons and daughters for Savoy's future. It is easy to imagine her loneliness. In Madrid, she had been the soft light of El Escorial, her father's companion in solitude. In Turin, she was surrounded by courtiers and servants, yet profoundly alone. Her husband's ambitions pulled him from her side, and the endless rhythm of pregnancies left her no time for rest, no time for herself. Still, she did not falter in her duty. Reports from the time describe her as beloved by the people, admired for her gentleness and her dignity. She spoke with humility, treated her attendants kindly, and gave audiences with a patience rare among rulers' wives. To the citizens of Turin, she was a duchess of compassion. To her father in Madrid, she remained a source of pride. But to herself, what was she? A wife? A mother? A pawn in the empire's endless game? The walls of the Savoy court, if they could speak, might tell of her late-night prayers, whispered in candlelight, as she prepared for yet another birth. They might echo with her sighs as letters arrived from Philip II, reminding her of her duty to uphold Spain's interests, even as her health withered. They might recall the silence that followed Charles Emmanuel's departures, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her children. The contrast is striking. Charles Emmanuel sought glory in the battlefield. Catalina bore the battles of the body. He dreamed of expanding Savoy's borders. She expanded his dynasty through blood and pain. He chased immortality in history. She risked mortality with every childbirth. This was the paradox of royal women in Europe. Their crowns were heavy not because they ruled, but because they carried life within them, again and again, until the strain consumed them. Catalina embodied this paradox fully. To the world, she appeared strong, radiant, a duchess admired by her people. But in truth, she was fragile, worn. Her body stretched beyond its limits, her spirit quietly enduring the burdens no one else would see. It is said that even when she was exhausted, pale, and weakened by pregnancy, she continued to smile at public events, her face a mask of serenity. That smile, like a veil, hid the cost of her life. It is the image of a woman carrying two worlds, the public world of power and politics, and the private world of sacrifice and suffering. As the years passed, the strain grew heavier. Catalina was still young, but the weight of duty aged her. She had entered Savoy as a bride full of grace. She was now a mother drained by endless obligation. Yet, to those who looked upon her, she remained untouchable, almost saintly. A duchess who gave everything for dynasty and faith. But within her, a shadow was growing. Each pregnancy was more dangerous than the last. Each birth left her weaker. Each child brought joy, yes, but also a lingering fear. Would this be the one that claimed her life? Her story was no longer about her father's cherished daughter. It was about a woman bound to a man of ambition, trapped in a cycle of childbirth, pressed into the mold of duty until nothing remained of herself. The marriage that began as a glittering alliance was now a burden that consumed her completely. And still, the world expected more. In the corridors of Turin's palaces, bells tolled again and again, each peal announcing the birth of another child. For courtiers and diplomats, the sound was a reassurance that the dynasty of Savoy thrived. For Catalina, it was a reminder that her body was no longer her own. In just 12 years of marriage, she carried 10 pregnancies, 10 cycles of hope and exhaustion, of swollen feet and trembling hands, of prayers whispered into pillows during long nights of pain. Each child was welcomed with ceremony, the cradle prepared, the baptismal font waiting. The court gathered in anticipation. Yet for Catalina, the joy was braided with dread. Every birth was a gamble with her life. Imagine the rhythm of those years. She had scarcely recovered from one confinement when she was again with child. Her figure never had time to rest, her strength never fully returned. Court observers wrote of her pale complexion, of hair that thinned, of the faint blue veins that stood out on her hands. She was young, only in her 20s, but her body carried the marks of a woman aged before her time. Still, she smiled. She fulfilled her role. A duchess was not measured by speeches or victories, but by the heirs she produced. And Catalina, trained since childhood to see duty as destiny, endured with quiet grace. She attended ceremonies, offered alms to the poor, received envoys, all while carrying life within her, as though nothing weighed heavier than the jewels on her gown. But in private, the toll was immense. Accounts speak of long recoveries, of fainting fits, of fevers that followed births. The midwives and physicians of Savoy did what they could. But in the 16th century, medicine was little more than prayer and instinct. Every complication threatened catastrophe. Every labor could end with blood and silence. Her ladies-in-waiting must have seen the cost most clearly. They saw her clutching the arms of a chair as contractions gripped her body. They heard her gasps echo in chambers where tapestries and candles could not soften the brutality of childbirth. They cleaned the linens, stained by blood and sweat. And when the infant's cry finally pierced the night, they saw Catalina's exhausted smile, her face pale as parchment, her eyes glazed with both love and pain. Her children were many, but their survival was not assured. In an age of fragile infancy, several died young. To Catalina, each loss was another wound. She endured not only the pain of birth, but the grief of watching coffins carried from the palace, each one smaller than the last. And yet, she pressed forward, because this was her role: to give, to sacrifice, to replenish the line no matter the cost. A chronicler once compared royal women to candles, burning themselves down to give light to the dynasty. Catalina was such a candle. Each pregnancy consumed her a little more. Each delivery left her weaker, until she flickered in the wind. To the people of Turin, she was still adored. They called her compassionate, admired her piety, saw her as a model duchess. They did not see the nights when she struggled to breathe after labor, nor the mornings when she forced herself to rise, her body aching, to attend mass or a court gathering. To the outside world, she was grace embodied. Inside, she was survival itself. Even her father, Philip II, though far away in Madrid, sensed her decline. Letters from Spain urged her to care for her health, to pace herself, to remember that she was not only a duchess, but his cherished daughter. But what could she do? A duchess who refused her duty was no duchess at all. Her womb was the foundation of the alliance, her survival secondary. There is a haunting irony here. Philip II, who had built El Escorial as a monument to faith and discipline, who saw his daughters as extensions of his dynasty, now watched from afar as the daughter who once lit his solitude was consumed by the very role he had chosen for her. And so the years rolled on, birth after birth, funeral after funeral, joy braided with grief, strength replaced by fragility. Catalina's world narrowed to the cycle of expectation. Carry, deliver, recover, repeat. The court celebrated her as fruitful, as blessed, even as her body wasted away. In these years, she must have asked herself, though silently, perhaps only in her prayers, how many times could a body endure this trial? How many lives could she give before she lost her own? Did she ever long for the freedom to simply be, to walk without the weight of expectation, to breathe without the shadow of another pregnancy looming? We will never know her private words. History records her public role, her children, her alliances, her duties. But behind the silence of the record lies a deeper truth. Catalina lived in a prison not of stone, but of obligation. She was not chained by iron, but by expectation. And in some ways, that prison was harder to escape. The image of Catalina in these years is one of resilience wrapped in fragility. A duchess in fine gowns, her hands resting on the cradle of yet another child, her smile unwavering though her body trembled. A woman who endured, because to endure was all that was asked of her, and all that she could do. She was, in every sense, a mother of dynasties. But she was also a victim of dynasties. A life drained in service of names, titles, and ambitions that outlived her. And as the years crept closer to 1597, the cycle neared its breaking point. Catalina was only 30, yet already worn to the edge of mortality. She would enter her 10th labor with a body weakened by sacrifice, a spirit strained by endless duty. And this time, the gamble would not spare her. The candle had burned almost to the end. The autumn of 1597 descended upon Turin with a chill that seeped into the stones of the Savoy palace. Inside, the great halls, usually alive with music and the laughter of courtiers, grew quieter, subdued by a tension that all could feel, but none dared to voice. Catalina Micaela, the Duchess of Savoy, was again with child, for the 10th time in 12 years. Her ladies whispered in corners, their faces pale beneath the candlelight. They had seen her body diminish with each passing year, seen her hands tremble as she signed letters, seen her force a smile at audiences when her strength was already spent. Now, as she approached yet another confinement, the air itself seemed heavy, as though the palace anticipated tragedy. The day of labor arrived. Catalina's chambers were prepared as they always were. Linen sheets fresh and stiff with starch, silver basins polished, crucifixes hanging above the bed, candles lit to remind all that God watched over the ordeal. Physicians and midwives waited with their instruments, though they knew their skills were limited. In this age, childbirth was not a science but a gamble, and prayer was often the only medicine. Catalina lay upon the bed, her face pale, her hair damp with sweat even before the first contraction gripped her. She had endured this pain 9 times before, yet this time felt different. Her body was weaker, slower to respond, as though the very strength to endure had already been spent. Hours passed. The corridors outside filled with muffled footsteps as attendants and courtiers paced, waiting for news. Bells stood ready to toll, either for joy or for mourning. Within the chamber, cries of effort, whispered prayers, and the low murmur of the midwives created a rhythm both desperate and solemn. Catalina clutched the hand of her closest attendant, her voice a whisper through clenched teeth. "If I do not survive this night," she murmured, "see that my father is told. Do not let him be alone." The words revealed what lay closest to her heart. Not the politics of Savoy, not even the fate of her husband, but her father, the lonely king in Madrid who had once found light in her presence. Even at the threshold of death, she thought of him. The labor dragged on. The child within her, the 10th in her short life, seemed unwilling to enter the world. Each contraction wrung her body of its last reserves. The physicians looked at one another, fear hidden behind professional masks. They whispered of blood loss, of exhaustion. One clutched his rosary beads as if medicine had already failed. At last a child was delivered, but the infant did not cry. The silence was deafening. Midwives tried, prayed, pressed their hands against the tiny body, but life did not stir. Catalina, though barely conscious, seemed to sense it. A single tear slid down her cheek as she whispered, "God's will." The baby was laid aside, still and silent, a fragile reminder of hope extinguished. Yet Catalina's ordeal was not over. The bleeding did not stop. Sheets were soaked, the air heavy with the metallic scent of blood mingled with candle smoke. The physicians moved frantically, calling for compresses, whispering instructions, yet their eyes betrayed despair. The attendants wept quietly, for they knew the truth. The Duchess was slipping beyond their reach. In the chaos of the chamber, there was a terrible stillness in Catalina herself. Her face grew pale as marble. Her lips turned faintly blue, and her breathing became shallow, ragged. Between gasps, she tried to form words. Words for her children, words for her father, words for the God she had served faithfully all her life. But the sentences broke apart, carried away in the waves of pain and fading strength. Her husband, Charles Emmanuel, was not at her side. He was away, consumed by his ambitions, his campaigns. Some say he was notified too late, others that his absence was deliberate, for the battlefield had always meant more to him than the bedchamber. In that critical moment, Catalina was alone, surrounded not by family, but by physicians, attendants, and the silent company of death. As the night deepened, the candles burned lower. The midwives continued their hopeless work, but Catalina's body grew colder, her pulse weaker. It was as if the candle that had burned so fiercely through duty and sacrifice was finally guttering out. Those who witnessed her final hours remembered her serenity amid the torment. She did not rage, did not curse, did not plead. Instead, her last words were simple, whispered through cracked lips. "Do not let him be alone." A daughter's love for her father, carried even into the shadow of death. Then came the silence. The room stilled. A duchess, a princess of Spain, the beloved daughter of Philip II, was gone. She had given her life as she had given her years. Consumed by duty, her body broken by the relentless demand of dynasty. She was 30 years old. Outside, the bells tolled, not the joyful peals of celebration, but the mournful, drawn-out knells of death. The sound carried across Turin, through narrow streets and open squares, reaching the ears of commoners and nobles alike. News spread quickly. The Duchess was dead. The child was dead. The palace was draped in black. Courtiers wept, though quietly, for in courts grief was often restrained, measured, performed. But among the people of Turin, there was genuine mourning. They had loved her, this Spanish princess who had carried herself with humility, who had listened to their pleas, who had borne the weight of duty without arrogance. To them, she was not only a duchess, but a symbol of kindness. And in Madrid, when the news reached Philip II, the grief was devastating. The old king, weary and ill, had lost the daughter who had once been the light of El Escorial. "I have lost the child God left me to ease my solitude," he is said to have lamented. It was perhaps the final, most crushing blow of his long reign. Thus ended Catalina's final labor, the labor that delivered not life, but death, not joy, but grief. The 10th child she bore became the costliest, for in delivering it, she surrendered her own. Her story, already one of sacrifice, now entered its darkest chapter. The Duchess who had given everything was gone, and the silence that followed her passing would echo for years. The morning after Catalina's final labor, Turin awoke to a world changed. The bells rang slow and heavy, their sound crawling across rooftops, slipping into narrow streets, pressing down on every ear with the weight of tragedy. The people of the duchy, accustomed to the thunder of their duke's ambitions, now faced the silence left by his duchess. Catalina Micaela, daughter of Spain, Duchess of Savoy, was gone. Only 30 years old, an age when most lives have not yet reached their prime, hers had already been consumed. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. Attendants who had served her since she first arrived in Savoy moved about in hushed grief, their eyes swollen with tears. The great hall, usually resplendent with gold and banners, was draped in black. Candles flickered in every chamber, their wavering light more funeral than festive. Her body lay upon a bier covered in fine cloth, her face pale but strangely serene, as if death had finally released her from the years of burden. It is one of history's cruel ironies that women like Catalina, whose lives were defined by duty, were often most visible only in their deaths. In life, she had been the silent strength of the Savoy court, bearing children, soothing disputes, embodying Spain's power in Italy. But in death, she became a spectacle of mourning, her absence louder than her presence had ever been allowed to be. The courtiers whispered their condolences, but beneath their words lay fear. For a duchess's death was not merely personal, it carried political consequences. Her passing severed a living link to Spain, a tie that gave Savoy both legitimacy and protection. Charles Emmanuel, her husband, might continue his wars and ambitions, but without Catalina, he had lost the figure who made his rule palatable, the gentle balance to his restlessness. Far away in Madrid, the news struck her father with a force no army could deliver. Philip II, already bowed by age, gout, and the burdens of empire, received the letter announcing Catalina's death and was undone. The king, known for his iron will, for his capacity to endure endless wars and betrayals, could not endure the loss of this daughter. She had been his companion in solitude, the one who softened the cold halls of El Escorial with her presence. Now, in his final years, she was torn from him. "I have lost the child God left me to ease my loneliness," he lamented. For a king who ruled half the world, it was the most personal of defeats. Her death at 30 became more than a family tragedy. It became a symbol. Across Europe, monarchs and nobles understood what it meant. This was the cost of dynasty, the toll exacted by marriage politics and dynastic ambition. Catalina had not died by sword or poison, but by the relentless cycle of expectation placed upon royal women. 10 children in 12 years, one after another, until her body gave way. She was not killed by enemies, she was consumed by duty. Her contemporaries may not have used the language of sacrifice, but that is what her death represented. She had been offered on the altar of dynastic continuity. Her womb had been her battlefield, and it was there that she fell. The people of Turin, who had loved her for her gentleness, wept openly. They lined the streets as her coffin was carried, their grief unrestrained by the protocols that bound the nobility. For them, she had been more than a political bride. She had been a duchess who listened, who cared, who carried herself with dignity despite her burdens. Their sorrow was not for Savoy alone, but for the woman they had come to see as their own. Even within the Savoy palace, where political calculation often outweighed emotion, there was an unshakable sense of loss. The courtiers, who had seen her suffer in silence, now confronted the emptiness of her absence. They spoke of her kindness, of her patience, of the way she had endured without complaint. In a world where ambition was currency, Catalina's currency had been compassion, and now it was gone. In Spain, her death was seen as a blow to the Habsburg dynasty itself. For Philip II, already in decline, it marked the unraveling of the personal bonds that had once held his private world together. His empire was vast, but his family was fragile, and Catalina's loss underscored how little even the most powerful could control. It is worth pausing to imagine her final image in the minds of those who loved her. Not the Duchess draped in silks, not the mother surrounded by children, but the pale, exhausted woman lying upon her bed, whispering to her attendant to tell her father not to be alone. That is the true measure of her life, not the treaties her marriage secured, nor the heirs she produced, but the love she carried for her father until the end. At 30, she had given more than most give in a lifetime. She had given her youth, her health, her very life, and still it had not been enough. The dynasty demanded, and she obeyed, until she could give no more. And so, Catalina Micaela of Spain died, not as a warrior, not as a ruler, but as a daughter and mother, consumed by the duties that had defined her from birth. Her story, though centuries old, still echoes, for it asks a question that history rarely dares to answer. How many lives were sacrificed, not by war or treachery, but by expectation itself? The answer lay in her coffin, carried through the streets of Turin, mourned by a people who knew they had lost not just a duchess, but a soul. Turin was draped in mourning. The banners that only months earlier had celebrated military victories and public festivals now hung in black, their edges trailing in the wind like wounds that would not close. The duchy seemed to breathe in silence, every church bell echoing with sorrow, every mass offered in the name of the young duchess who had given her life in childbirth. Catalina's funeral was not a private affair. It could not be. Her death at only 30 years old, and the stillness of the infant who had not survived, had struck the people of Savoy with an intimacy they had not expected. They lined the narrow streets as the procession moved through Turin, holding candles, clutching rosaries, some kneeling as her coffin passed. To them, she had not been distant royalty, but a figure they believed in, a duchess who embodied kindness, who had been present in their lives through charity and gentleness. Inside the royal chapel of the Holy Shroud, the air was heavy with incense. Priests intoned the Latin prayers of Requiem, their voices rising like smoke into the vaulted ceilings. The coffin, draped in rich fabric embroidered with Spain's heraldic lions and castles, was lowered before the altar. Courtiers wept in silence, though their tears were as much about what had been lost politically as about grief for Catalina herself. The dynasty of Savoy had lost a Spanish princess, and Spain had lost its cherished daughter. Charles Emmanuel III, her husband, was present, though his face betrayed little. Ambition had long been the engine of his life, and even in the shadow of Catalina's coffin, his mind was rumored to be on campaigns, fortresses, and treaties. Yet even he, restless and consumed by politics, could not fully ignore the loss. His Duchess had been his link to the greatest power in Europe. Her presence had softened his image, given legitimacy to his rule. Without her, he was left exposed, an ambitious duke without the moral anchor Catalina had provided. But it was not in Turin that the deepest wound was felt. It was in Madrid. When news reached Philip II, the aging king retreated into grief. He was 69, weakened by gout and years of exhaustion, his body failing even as his empire stretched across oceans. Yet none of his ailments cut so sharply as the loss of Catalina. She had been his consolation after the death of her mother, Elizabeth of Valois. She had been the child who softened his solitude in the stern, cold halls of El Escorial. And now, she was gone. Philip was not a man of outbursts, but chroniclers record that his sorrow was visible, his voice heavy with pain as he spoke of her. "I have lost the child God left me to ease my loneliness," he confessed. For a king whose every decision was framed in the language of destiny and divine providence, this death must have felt like betrayal. The God he had served so rigorously had taken the one daughter who had been his solace. The Spanish court, already a place of severity, sank deeper into gloom. Black cloth draped over El Escorial's stone walls, candles burned at altars day and night, and the king moved like a shadow through the vast monastery palace. Those who saw him in those days spoke of a monarch crushed not by enemies abroad, but by grief within his own house. He had survived rebellions, wars, and the weight of empire. But the loss of Catalina was, in many ways, the final crack in his heart. In Europe at large, her death became a reminder of a truth so often ignored by chronicles of kings and generals: the price women paid for dynasty. Letters circulated from courts in France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, each one remarking not on a battle or treaty, but on a duchess cut down by childbirth. Diplomats framed it in terms of succession and alliance. But behind the words lay a quiet recognition that Catalina's story was not unique. She was one of many. Princesses, queens, and duchesses who gave their lives in the act of producing heirs. The empire grieved her as a symbol, but the people mourned her as a person. In Turin, ordinary citizens remembered her almsgiving, her gentle presence in processions, her smile when she greeted them. In Madrid, courtiers recalled how she had brought warmth to Philip's solitary life. For a brief moment, her death united high and low in sorrow, as if all had lost someone dear. Yet grief in dynasties rarely lingers untainted. Soon her death was folded into politics, her memory used to strengthen the bond between Savoy and Spain. Treaties were reaffirmed, marriages considered for her surviving children. Her coffin may have been lowered into silence, but her name became a token once again in the game of power. The tenderness of mourning gave way to the coldness of strategy. Still, the image of Catalina as a young mother of 10, dead at 30, remained in the minds of those who witnessed her end. She became, for some, the embodiment of the hidden cost of empire. Not soldiers fallen in battle, but women lost in childbirth, their sacrifices unnamed in treaties, but carved into the survival of dynasties. It is telling that Philip II himself, the most powerful monarch of his age, carried her loss as one of the deepest sorrows of his reign. He would live only a few more years, and when death finally came for him, some said it was Catalina's absence that had hollowed him most. For a king who had commanded armies and built empires, it was the loss of his daughter that left him most powerless. The grieving empire stretched across continents, but in its heart was a silence shaped like Catalina Micaela, the daughter who had been light in El Escorial, the Duchess who had been hope in Turin, the woman who gave everything and was left with nothing. Her story did not end with her coffin, but in the sorrow of those who loved her, and in the memory of a sacrifice that empire itself could not hide. Time is a relentless eraser. The same bells that tolled for Catalina's death in 1597 soon rang for other events. New campaigns led by her husband, Charles Emmanuel. New alliances forged and broken. New heirs born into dynasties that demanded constant renewal. The sorrow that had once blanketed Turin slowly lifted, leaving her memory to fade like the smoke of incense after a funeral mass. For a short while, her image lingered in whispers. In the first months after her passing, courtiers spoke tenderly of the Duchess, who had died too young. Priests in Turin preached sermons about her humility, her piety, her sacrifice. But as the years passed, those words softened, became formalized, and eventually fell silent. She was remembered only when convenient, when her name was useful to reinforce Spain's bond with Savoy, or when her children needed to remind the world of their Habsburg blood. Charles Emmanuel himself, restless and ever ambitious, did little to preserve her memory. He marched forward with his plans, waging wars, bargaining with kings, plotting to carve out greater power for Savoy. Catalina had been his bridge to Spain. But with her gone, he sought new paths, new marriages for their surviving children, new opportunities for himself. If he mourned her privately, history does not record it. Publicly, she became little more than a chapter closed, a duty fulfilled. Her children should have been her legacy. Yet even there, her presence dimmed. Of the 10 births, only a handful survived beyond childhood. Some died before they could even walk, their tiny graves tucked into the shadows of Turin's chapels. Others lived, but carried little memory of their mother, for they had been so young when she died. The line continued, yes, but Catalina herself did not. She was not commemorated in the stories of her offspring as a guiding figure, as a mother who shaped their lives. Instead, she hovered as a shadow, invoked only as a name on genealogies, a link in the chain of blood. In Spain, where she had once been the light of El Escorial, her absence was sharper. Philip II mourned her deeply, but after his own death only a year later, the thread of memory weakened. The Spanish court moved on to other concerns: the succession of Philip III, the decline of empire, the endless wars that drained the treasury. Catalina's name was rarely spoken, except as a footnote. One of Philip's daughters, married to Savoy, dead young. Thus, the woman who had borne 10 children, who had governed Turin in her husband's absence, who had given her strength until her body gave way, slipped from history's stage. Unlike queens who ruled or princesses embroiled in scandal, Catalina left no drama, no grand narrative to keep her alive in memory. Her story was one of endurance and sacrifice, and those are the stories most easily forgotten. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. The traces of her life remained, faint but persistent. In Turin, her charitable works left echoes among the poor who had once benefited from her kindness. In El Escorial, her father's sorrow was a testament to the bond they shared. And in the genealogies of Europe, her bloodline continued to ripple outward, entwined with other houses, quietly shaping the dynasties of centuries to come. Still, when one visits the chapels and palaces of Turin today, her presence is nearly invisible. The grand monuments celebrate generals, dukes, saints. Catalina's tomb, by contrast, is modest, easily overlooked. There is no triumph in its stone, no proclamation of her worth, only the silence of a life consumed by duty and a death too ordinary to stir legends. And yet, perhaps that is precisely why her story matters. Catalina represents the countless women of her rank who were forgotten not because they failed, but because they fulfilled their roles too well. They gave what was asked of them: children, obedience, humility, and in return, history passed them by. It is easier for memory to cling to rebels and conquerors, to saints and villains. But what of the dutiful, the obedient, the women who bore the silent burdens of empire? Catalina's life asks us to remember that dynasties were not built only on swords and treaties, but on wombs and blood, on the repeated sacrifices of women whose names were later reduced to shadows. The image of her as a forgotten mother is haunting. She had been cherished by her father, admired by her people. Yet, in death, she became invisible. Her husband's ambitions overshadowed her. Her children, though living, carried little of her story forward. In the tapestry of European royalty, her thread is thin, nearly lost among the brighter strands of kings and queens who left louder marks. But in that quietness lies a deeper truth. Catalina's erasure is itself a symbol. It reminds us how history often silences women, how their lives are measured by what they gave rather than who they were. To be forgotten was, in many ways, the final act of her tragedy. So we stand before her story not as readers of great conquests or bloody betrayals, but as witnesses to silence. Silence in the halls of Savoy, silence in the chronicles of Spain, silence in the tomb where she rests, silence that conceals not weakness, but sacrifice. Catalina Micaela, the forgotten mother, was more than a name in a genealogy. She was a woman who carried 10 lives, who held her father's loneliness at bay, who gave her body to a dynasty that scarcely remembered her once she was gone. To recall her now is to break the silence that history laid over her, to lift her from the shadows where she was left, and to see not only the Duchess who died at 30, but the mother who endured until the end. Catalina Micaela's death was heartbreaking, but it was not unique. Across Europe, her story was repeated again and again, etched into the genealogies of queens and princesses whose lives were measured not in years of rule or deeds of power, but in the number of children they bore before their bodies gave way. She was part of a grim pattern, an unspoken epidemic of sacrifice that shaped dynasties yet left no monuments. In the 16th and 17th centuries, childbirth was perilous for any woman. But for women of royal blood, the danger was doubled. They were expected to produce heirs relentlessly, their pregnancies counted like military victories, their wombs treated as battlefields for dynastic survival. Medicine was primitive, infections common, blood loss often fatal. And unlike ordinary women who might have been spared by circumstance, queens and princesses were rarely allowed to rest. Every child was a safeguard against dynastic collapse, and so the cycle repeated until the inevitable tragedy arrived. Catalina's fate echoed that of Isabella II of Jerusalem, who died at only 26, worn out by multiple pregnancies, leaving behind a fragile kingdom in turmoil. It mirrored that of Margaret of Connaught, an English princess married into Sweden's royal house, who died while pregnant at just 38, her body succumbing to the strain of childbirth in a foreign land. It called to mind the countless duchesses of the Italian states, the queens of France, the Habsburg archduchesses, each remembered for the sons they bore rather than the lives they lost. What unites them is not their crowns, but their silence. None of these women raised armies, yet their bodies were treated as weapons. None of them signed treaties, yet their marriages were treaties embodied. They gave life not only to children, but to alliances. Their bloodline, the invisible ink of Europe's political maps. And when they died, their names were often reduced to a line in a chronicle. She bore X children, died in childbirth. That was the epitaph history allowed. Catalina's case is especially poignant because she was so beloved. She was not a remote queen locked in formality, but a duchess who listened to her people, who softened the austerity of her father Philip II, who carried dignity without arrogance. Yet even she could not escape the pattern. Her worth was measured in children, and when her 10th pregnancy claimed her life, it was accepted almost as inevitability. This acceptance is perhaps the most haunting part. For dynasties, the deaths of women like Catalina were tragedies, but they were also costs. Costs that were counted, absorbed, and moved past in the relentless march of politics. The same courts that draped themselves in black for her funeral would soon resume their dances, their campaigns, their treaties. Life moved on, as if the lives of these women were meant to be spent, extinguished in service of the throne. The cemeteries of Europe tell the story most vividly. Walk among the crypts of royal chapels, and you will see rows of names. Princesses dead at 22, duchesses gone at 25, queens silenced before 30. Their husbands lived longer, waging wars and governing states, while their wives lay beneath stone slabs, their portraits fading, their children left in the care of others. And yet, though forgotten by history's mainstream, they shaped its course in profound ways. Without them, dynasties would have fractured. Without their sacrifices, bloodlines would have ended, alliances collapsed. It is not the kings alone who held empires together. It was also the women who gave their lives, quietly and invisibly, to sustain the machinery of power. Catalina's death at 30 fits this cruel pattern perfectly. She was both singular and ordinary, singular in her bond with her father, ordinary in her fate as a royal mother who died too soon. The tragedy is not just that she died, but that her death was one among many. Part of a silent chorus of women whose sacrifices were normalized, their suffering invisible in the grand narratives of kings and empires. Think of the irony. In a world that celebrated the bravery of men on battlefields, no songs were sung for the women who faced death in childbirth again and again. Their courage was quiet, their battlefields confined to chambers lit by candles instead of torches, their weapons endurance and prayer instead of sword and shield. Yet their mortality rate was often higher than that of the soldiers who fought for their husbands. It is this paradox that makes Catalina's story so haunting. Her death was not an exception. It was the rule. And that rule repeated across centuries, carved invisible scars into Europe's dynastic history. Behind every triumphant king stood a wife or daughter who may have died bringing heirs into the world. Behind every alliance was a woman whose body carried the cost. To see Catalina only as an individual is to miss this larger truth. She was a symbol of the systemic sacrifice demanded of women in royal houses. Her life and death remind us that power was not sustained only by armies and treasuries, but by the repeated endurance of women whose names too often faded into silence. And yet, while her story fits the pattern, it also breaks through it. For in her bond with Philip II, in the grief that shook Spain's sternest king, in the mourning of Turin's people, Catalina's humanity refused to be erased entirely. She was more than a name, more than a womb, more than a forgotten duchess. She was a daughter, a mother, a woman who loved and was loved. And that makes her sacrifice all the more devastating. The pattern of royal sacrifice stretches across centuries. But Catalina Micaela's story allows us to pause and see it not as statistics or inevitabilities, but as lives. Lives like hers, cut short by expectation, erased by history, waiting to be remembered. Turin holds many monuments to ambition, fortresses, palaces, arches built to commemorate victories. But tucked within its heart lies a different monument, one not to triumph, but to silence. The royal chapel of the Holy Shroud, a place steeped in solemnity, became the resting place of Catalina Micaela, Duchess of Savoy. There, in the dim hush of marble and candlelight, her body was laid to rest, far from the Madrid where she was born, far from the father who had cherished her. Her tomb was modest, almost understated. Unlike the ornate sepulchres of kings carved with triumphal imagery, hers carried little more than the dignity of stone. It was a striking contrast. The daughter of the most powerful monarch in Europe, the wife of an ambitious duke, remembered not with grandeur, but with simplicity. It was as if history itself conspired to dim the light she had once brought to others. Visitors to the chapel would see rows of tombs, dukes, duchesses, princes, princesses, each part of the Savoy line. Among them, Catalina's rests quietly, one among many. No great inscriptions, no proclamations of her sacrifices, only the silence of stone and the fading of memory. Those who walk there today may pass her without pause unless they know to look, unless they know her story. The symbolism is haunting. Catalina's entire life had been marked by sacrifice that went unseen. Pregnancies endured, griefs swallowed, duties fulfilled without complaint. Her death, too, was absorbed into the machinery of dynastic necessity. And now, her tomb mirrored that same erasure, present but unremarkable, existing without demanding notice. The royal chapel itself is no ordinary burial site. It was designed to house the most sacred relic of Savoy, the Shroud of Turin, believed by many to bear the image of Christ. To be buried within its walls was an honor. Yet in Catalina's case, it also underscored the paradox of her life. She lay beside saints and princes, yet her presence was overshadowed by relics, politics, and the restless ambitions of those who outlived her. For the people of Turin, the chapel became a place of mourning. In the months after her burial, candles were lit in her memory, prayers whispered for her soul. Mothers brought their children to the altar, perhaps whispering silent thanks for the Duchess who had embodied their own struggles in grander form. But as years passed, the memory faded. Her tomb remained, but her story slipped into the background, eclipsed by new events, new rulers, new tragedies. It is easy to imagine the stillness of her tomb, the flicker of candles against stone, the faint smell of incense clinging to the air, the echo of footsteps across the marble floor. And there, among the sarcophagi, Catalina's presence waits, not in grandeur, but in quiet endurance. A woman who gave her life for dynasty, remembered only in passing, her story nearly erased by time. Yet the tomb speaks in its silence. It reminds us that not all sacrifices are honored with monuments. Not all tragedies are carved into history's stone. Some lie hidden, waiting for those willing to listen. Catalina's resting place is one such reminder. Her modest tomb stands as a quiet rebuke to the grandeur of her husband's ambitions, to the sweeping narratives of empire. It asks, without words, who remembers the women consumed by duty when the wars and treaties have passed? There is a deep symbolism in her burial so far from Spain. She had been Philip II's beloved daughter, the comfort of his solitude, the light of El Escorial. Yet she was not returned to him in death. She remained in Turin, in the land of her husband, as if her life's sacrifice demanded permanence. Her father grieved in Madrid, her body lay in Savoy, and between them stretched the silence of distance. She belonged to Spain in love, but to Savoy in duty. In death, duty won. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not her death itself, but the way it was absorbed into forgetfulness. The palace where she gave birth still stands, but no plaque tells of the Duchess who died there. The chapel that holds her tomb remains, but her name is only one among many. The silence that surrounds her tomb is the same silence that surrounded her life. A silence that hides sacrifice, that diminishes women whose worth was measured only in heirs. And yet, to stand before that tomb, to know her story, is to break the silence. To see her not as a forgotten duchess, but as a woman who endured, who gave, who suffered, and whose tomb testifies to the cost of power. Her resting place becomes less a symbol of erasure than of resistance. For in telling her story again, we refuse to let her be lost. Turin may have buried her, but history need not. Her tomb, modest as it is, becomes a monument when we remember it. Not a monument to victory, but to sacrifice. Not to conquest, but to endurance. And in that way, Catalina's resting place continues to speak, centuries later. The bells that tolled for her death have long been silent, the voices that mourned her long gone. But in the stillness of the royal chapel of the Holy Shroud, Catalina Micaela of Spain remains. Not a warrior, not a conqueror, but a duchess who bore 10 children and died at 30, her tomb a quiet reminder that history's greatest tragedies are not always written in battles, but in the hidden sacrifices of women who were expected to give everything, and did. Catalina Micaela did not die by sword, poison, or betrayal. She did not perish in the intrigues of court or the clash of kingdoms. She died in a bed, fulfilling the role that had been demanded of her since birth, the role of mother, repeated until her body could give no more. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Her death was not extraordinary, but ordinary for women of her time. Her story forces us to confront a truth that history books often gloss over. Dynasties were not only shaped by kings and generals, but by women who gave their lives in silence. Catalina's tomb in Turin is not just a monument to one duchess, but a symbol of thousands of women whose names have been forgotten. Each one endured the same gamble. Each one sacrificed her body for the survival of a crown, and each one risked being erased once her duty was done. And yet, as I tell her story, I feel a tension within myself. On one hand, Catalina embodies the tragedy of royal women trapped in dynastic duty. On the other, she embodies something deeper, an endurance, a kind of courage that has no statue, no anthem. She was not a warrior, but she fought. She was not a queen regnant, but she carried a kingdom within her womb 10 times. Her death at 30 was not weakness. It was the final cost of strength demanded too often, too unrelentingly. From my perspective, Catalina's life challenges how we remember history. We glorify the battlefield, but not the birthing chamber. We study treaties signed by men, but not the bodies of women who made those treaties possible through dynastic birth. To me, this imbalance is itself a kind of injustice. Her story, and the stories of women like her, remind us that power has always rested upon invisible sacrifices, sacrifices made in silence and buried in modest tombs. When I think of Catalina, I don't only see a Duchess of Savoy or a daughter of Spain. I see a woman whose fate resonates across centuries. I see the paradox of privilege. To be born into power was to be shielded from hunger and poverty, yet trapped in obligations that denied her selfhood. She lived not for herself, but for others, for her father, her husband, her children, her dynasty. And in the end, that is what killed her. So what do we do with her memory? Do we let her tomb remain silent, her story fade like so many others? Or do we speak it aloud, not as mere trivia, but as testimony? I believe Catalina's life deserves more than silence. It deserves remembrance, and it deserves reflection. Because in remembering her, we remember all the women erased by history's focus on kings. And I ask you, if you had lived her life, would you have chosen the crown, the duty, the endless cycle of sacrifice? Or would you have chosen freedom, even if it meant obscurity? These are not questions history answers, but questions it leaves for us. Catalina Micaela's tragedy lingers because it is not only hers. It belongs to all the women whose stories were never written. And when we listen closely, we hear their voices in hers. If you, like me, believe that these forgotten stories deserve to be told, that the silent sacrifices hidden behind thrones should no longer remain in the shadows, then I invite you to join me. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled, where we bring these buried histories to light. Stories of kings and queens, yes. But more importantly, stories of the people who paid the price for crowns. Stories like Catalina's, where tragedy and humanity meet. Because in her death, we do not just hear the cry of a duchess. We hear the echo of countless women silenced by history. And in remembering them, we restore their voices.